So welcome everybody. Today's session is, we had a session this morning which went very well, so welcome to the next session of our conference. So just a reminder that we're the Service Management and IT Asset Management Specialist Group for the BCS. We regularly organise events, often in London, but of course at the moment we're moving everything online, and we are actually really finding that because we've moved everything online, we're able to really take advantage of the virtual nature, and we've actually got a load of international people. And today we have our first international speaker, who's Jim Hussey. I hope I said that right, Jim. Who's based in Denver, Colorado, as some of you may have heard. So, and then this evening we've got another session as well. So it'd be great if you could log on for that at 6:30. So as we go through today's session, we will, Jim would like to actually answer questions throughout the session as we go. So he'll occasionally pause and say, are there any questions? Or if somebody posts a question, then I might sort of jump in and say, Jim, we've got a question. So please it's not just questions either, it's comments. Jim's really keen to have it as interactive as possible. So please do put your comments and questions in the question box, and I will read them out so Jim can respond. And finally, please do tweet about the conference, or say something on LinkedIn. It would be great. The hashtag for the conference is SM, so S for sugar, M for mother, ITAM, so SMITAM Conf, CONF for Foxtrot 2020. So please do shout about us on social media. Right. So Jim is going to be speaking today about software as a service optimization, and I will hand over to Jim so that he can start his talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kylie, and this afternoon, good afternoon to all. My name is Jim Hussey, and appreciate spending the time with you today. Really do appreciate the BCS allowing me to be part of the agenda, and hopefully the information we're about to share and discuss is of value. I like to play off the theme of a survival guide. It's a concept that came to me, about 2 years back, as I was sitting in the airport, actually in the Montreal airport, after leaving a very large global organization and seeing the state of their SAM and their SaaS capabilities, and wondering to myself, how the heck are people going to survive this insanity right now? So it's a little bit of a play on words, but tongue in cheek, but hopefully you find this beneficial. I must apologize because as you can likely tell by my voice and my accent, I'm not from the UK or Europe. I'm an American, and at that, I'm a New Yorker by birth, so I apologize, and we'll try to use not too many Americanisms as I go through the presentation. So happy to explain what I mean if it doesn't make sense. So for those of us in the SaaS community, software asset as well as software as a service, is the question I put forward and discuss with many of my clients today is, can you truly optimize what is not effectively governed? And I can share with you that I had that conversation just Friday morning with a large global whose organization is based out of Paris. And they're struggling with their SaaS spend, but at the end of the day, the relationship just isn't being governed. So how do you truly harness the value of SaaS and optimize that SaaS? But if I could, let me take a moment to talk about myself. So I'd like you to contextually understand the perspective I bring. In a corporate role, back here in Denver, Colorado, where I live, I was responsible for a global financial organization. I was the head of IT vendor management, and that included software asset management, as well as an area called third-party risk. And that's an area or a subject that's become also very, very top of mind over the past several years. So when I speak, I'm really trying to bring to you the inner workings, or for those of you who are in an organization who are struggling with these issues, I was in the same place. I'm very, very fortunate that I had some really great individuals at my former employer, Western Union, to really talk about this SaaS challenge that was emerging. Again, what I will try to do is share with you that perspective of what it's like when the consultant or when the platform provider leaves the room, the door gets closed, and you're sitting there with the CIO or the CFO, and you have to have those tough internal conversations. So hopefully you find that of value. So what we're going to do today is I really want to kind of set the stage. Well, why are we here today? What is the issues that we're facing? And what perhaps the future looks like. I then want to move into the comment or the concept of segmentation. Everyone has a life cycle view. I offer one here, and my goal is to provide a quick visual of a template. So ultimately, what I'm trying to do for the participants today is outline a framework that you can apply in your current roles and begin to realize some value and really begin to harness some of these challenges that have emerged around the concept of SaaS. What I'd like to do, guys, is as we go into the presentation, if there's anything really specific you'd like to talk about or get my perspective on, please make sure to use the chat. And then Kylie, if you see something come in, just call out, and I'll stop the presentation and address the question. Okay, sound fair, guys?
Sounds great.
Okay. All right. So the reason we're here today is obviously our great friends Gartner. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I was very fortunate at Western Union, where I worked with a great team, and one of the leading analysts now at Gartner was my sourcing peer, my sourcing partner at Western Union. So we actually, when we were at Western Union, were challenged with coming up with a SaaS evaluation, risk identification, and onboarding process. So I'm very fortunate that I'm able to use a lot of his information that he produces at Gartner. But no secret here, what we have is we have a segment that is growing, and with the events of COVID and the last 6-7 months of what we've all experienced, significant growth has occurred. So what are the challenges, and how do we as an organization, as an end user or a client organization, really make certain that we're getting full advantage? So my orientation here is not going to be so much about wasted spend, but it's going to be about harnessing the value for our investment. Excuse me 1 second.
Jim, you're still on mute.
I think you might have gone on mute, Jim.
All right. Got the dashboard. Saved you that. I was mentioning how much I like Cafe Nero, but anyway. So ultimately, really what I want to bring forward, and the team begins to think about, is we as an organization, within your organization, it's really about a collaborative effort to really effectively manage and govern and optimize these SaaS relationships. So we're moving towards slides that'll talk about optimization, but it's not just about cost reduction. It's about really harnessing the value of it. So Gartner talks about strategic vendor programs. We really want to talk about all of that, but ultimately make sure the spend is as efficient as possible. So sourcing, IT leaders, vendor management, third-party risk management is what the TPRM stands for. And for those of you in regulated industries, you're very familiar with that term. And then, of course, software asset management professionals. There'll be others on the periphery, IT finance is another key player, but we all need to work together, and that's what we'll be talking about in the coming slides. Okay.
So Jim, just to jump in, we've had a question, a comment more, sort of questioning, for want of a better word, the concept of optimization. So somebody said, should we be trying to optimize software as a service, or should we be trying to satisfy it? And that's a term that an economist called Herbert Simon used, and it's sort of a combination of satisfy and suffice. So I guess in the way I would put it is good enough. So I guess what's the difference between optimizing and good enough, or is good enough just good enough? Is the question.
That's a great question, and it absolutely is. And we'll talk more about this as we get on. But the organizations in particular, if you think about what's viewed as optimization. And in my current role, I work with an organization called NPI, and the primary customer base for NPI is sourcing. So many times people in sourcing will look at that renewal and negotiate a 5% reduction in the price and feel like they've achieved optimization. And they put on the chalkboard, you know, we saved this money, cost avoidance, and they take credit and off they go. But is that really optimization? And so I think this question really comes back to what is optimization and how do you assess sufficient optimization? Because ultimately, when you're within an organization, when budgets are given out, you as either a SAM professional, vendor management, or third-party risk, or whatever, what your job is to do is to try to harness and make sure that budget is spent wisely. But at the end of the day, if you realize a cost save or an optimization, where does the money go? Does that money go back to that individual's budget? Does it go back to a central budget? Which is why there's a lot that needs to be defined before organizations or business units or the P&L owner actually want to optimize, right? So that's a very, very good question, and optimization is elusive. For me, I think the key thing is what is it? Quantity times price equals optimization. And in the world of SaaS, what I'm finding is, even though the data is readily available, organizations are not carefully looking at what they're using. So they negotiate the price, claim victory, claim optimization, but at the end of the day, it's been perhaps a price being applied to a base or usage level that may have a lot of fluff in it that could be saved. So whoever asked that question, please let me know if I did answer that sufficiently, or we can keep that dialogue going as we go through the presentation. But that is really ultimately where we are, and my position is, can you really optimize what you're not governing? Because if you're not governing it, it means ultimately you have all these relationships throughout the organization, onboarding, offboarding, standing up of the SaaS capability, and you're not perhaps the metrics, the service levels, the manner or count of usage has not been fully educated or communicated throughout the organization. Okay. So Kylie, so please make sure if that individual would like to continue that, we can do so.
He says he's very happy with Jim's expansion.
Okay, so here's some of the respect, my expansion. I like that. Today we talk about SaaS as one market, and personally, I think that's a massive mistake. In the early days, 20 years ago, was Salesforce kind of got this whole thing started. But what's happened is we have, and if you listen to Xylo, and I very much appreciate and like the Xylo offering and the team at Xylo, there are thousands of SaaS capabilities. You know, my wife is CFO at her firm. She's in the real estate management area, and they have a product, Yardi, that really just dominates that industry. It's basically the ERP, SaaS-based ERP in that segment. So you've got all of these wonderful platforms that have come out to really solve a particular business problem. The issue, as I see it, and is that the spend, right? So as those of us who are vendor management, IT finance, or even, you know, let's say a SaaS COE representatives, is what we're seeing is that the enterprise category of SaaS is beginning to dominate the spend, right? And what I mean by enterprise SaaS is Office 365, Salesforce, ServiceNow, SAP SuccessFactors, and SAP just made an acquisition last week in the e-commerce space, so we see them increasingly coming after the Salesforce space. Workday, of course. So you're seeing more and more of these organizations that really are offering enterprise SaaS, where a single sign-on view of optimization may or may not actually be effective, right? So as we go forward, what my premise is, or what I'm putting forward in this presentation, is that we, as SaaS matures, as SaaS continues to grow dramatically, we need to begin to look at it as a multidimensional segment and apply the appropriate diligence, the appropriate governance, and then ultimately apply optimization strategies based on those very important criteria or classifications. Okay? So what I like to do, and there's lots of life cycle charts out there. I was listening in on a presentation on Friday, and you know, the individual was talking about SaaS, talked about the four primary areas or segments. Here I've identified 6, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. But the real issue for us here is, what are those items that, or those sub-process areas underneath each of these that we're really going to have to establish some criteria. And again, if in the previous slide I talked about looking at it and saying, okay, let's take SaaS and begin to put those providers into some logical buckets, some logical segments. Now, when you have those, for example, if you're negotiating your renewal with Salesforce, it's going to be very different than a project management tool with a 1-year renewal that is happening to support one of your business units in the far off corners of the globe, right? So what you do is you look at these segments or categories, and then you really want to develop the idea of what is the appropriate level of monitoring necessary to do this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I was very fortunate where at my organization, I represented third-party risk. So I had my third-party risk director in the sessions as well. But we sat with InfoSec, with sourcing, with IT, and we worked through this life cycle and developed kind of a rough framework on how we were going to evaluate a SaaS provider or a SaaS solution, determine the level of governance that they would need, and then how they would be harvested or terminated or removed. And what we developed was something that looked very basic. And again, this is just meant to serve as an example. So for all of you who were just looking at, here's the life cycle of SaaS. It's easy to sit down, especially when you have a collaborative effort, because each of these cycles means something different to the person within your organization. So a third-party risk person is going to see this life cycle and elements in it different than a SAM person, different from ITAM, different from vendor management. And the beauty is, go ahead. What question?
Well, I was just thinking this really chimes quite well with the comment that somebody else made about the fact that actually the optimization process itself and placing things under governance in the way that you're suggesting is itself expensive. So is that one of the things that is driving this segmentation that you're talking about?
Self-expensing? Is that
No,
what you said, Kylie?
it's expensive. Optimization itself
Mhm.
is an expensive activity. So it uses a lot of resource, it takes up a lot of people's time. So I was wondering, is that what is driving, one of the things that is driving this approach that you're recommending of segmenting your SaaS providers to determine the level of governance?
Let me try to answer that. So I'll go back here. The suggestion is that the level of effort and governance, if we want to talk about your resilience of your organization, is that enterprise SaaS really requires a significant amount of governance activities across a broad range of teams or cross-functional teams. So yes, there's a manpower requirement that would come with that. So for example, for those of you who use Salesforce, one of the initial discussions you get in is how many orgs should you have, and based on the number of orgs, what's the level of governance to be applied. So really what we're trying to say is by putting people into segments, it will allow you then to identify the appropriate level of diligence necessary by segment to manage risk. So the investment here has to do with risk to the organization, resilience of your ability to provide your services, and making sure that they're aligned. So Kylie, did that address your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I think the point that the person's saying is that more governance than one needs is where it gets expensive. So right size your governance, I guess, which is segmentation is one way of doing that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where if you look at a lot of times when it comes to SaaS, people are talking about, well, what platform should I get? so that's great, and yeah, you need to have that platform to enable some of this. But when it does come to the enterprise category of SaaS, many of those platforms, now you shift over to the concept of maybe a Flexera, Snow, Aspira type platform versus a silo. But at the end of the day, it really takes manpower
Right.
to sit down and do this. So yes, and so for example, many organizations, Salesforce has become a strategic platform, and they're buying platforms and then doing custom configurations, custom development on top of the platform. So yes, that now means it's fully running your business and requires that diligence. Whereas the other ones, when you start talking about maybe a functional SaaS or a task-specific SaaS, maybe those are sufficient where you just make sure from an onboarding standpoint that they're not touching data, that the appropriate data controls are in place, and then those you can monitor far less aggressively.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Okay, so really this was trying to talk about the what, and the very simple table here is something that whoever is on point for SaaS within your organization, you can get InfoSec in the room, IT finance, vendor management, IT, get the group together and you can talk about, hey, what are those criteria? And what we had done previously is we then developed workflows in Archer, which was our governance, risk, and compliance platform. So when anyone would bring in the idea of committing to a SaaS or signing up to a SaaS, we had the controls in place where it had to drop in through this type of a filter. Okay. So what does that do? That now sets us up to do governance. And yes, governance, effective governance requires not only an investment, perhaps in technology, even though I see that further down the line, but it definitely requires, to the question that was asked, manpower. And not only manpower, but expertise in that manpower. So really very quickly here, what I have is is the executive sponsor. There's a lot of great individuals out there. They get very excited when a SaaS offering comes in. they want to be the sponsor for that. They get approved because this technology is now going to be part of the roadmap. And then many times that individual who is the sponsor is off to the next project, and things get forgotten. But when the green box here is something that I've spent a lot of time in my career in, is the idea of rules of engagement. So that's really for internal teams as well as the extended team when you're engaging with the third parties. And we like to talk about shadow IT. And I spent a lot of times talking with organizations, and they're anxious about this emergence or reemergence or continued emergence of shadow IT. But in actuality, shadow IT is just because so many organizations are siloed. The moment budgets get assigned and divided up and assigned out to multiple different groups, you have a silo. And we need to try to get those individuals to collaborate and work together. But again, you can see, all of the elements here that I'm calling out in terms of the governance framework, and then what I propose for those of us who are trying to bring forward the SaaS mission, whether it be in a COE type of concept or in another form that we'll talk about in a moment, is a RACI. Roles and responsibilities, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. We can break that out by those governance characteristics or segments that we've identified. And again, you feel free to use this simple template, and you can identify any of those areas on the left that would be appropriate for your organization, and then any of the roles within your organization that makes sense. And it's really a great opportunity to have people sit down and workshop, because what you want to be able to do is make sure that the collaboration is there. So when we've already know what segments we're talking about, we already know the criteria by which those will be onboarded, managed, and so forth. Now we're going to talk about the actual work that's going on. Okay, so Kylie, has any additional questions come in?
Actually, no, but what you have said really reminded me of something that a friend of mine posted on LinkedIn the other day. He very much comes from he's a CIO and very much has that business focus that CIOs CIOs that are good CIOs have to have. And in fact, he just posted something that said something along the lines of, if you don't have grey IT or shadow IT in your organization, is your organization agile enough and flexible enough to survive? So from his view, the shadow IT is actually the business getting on and adapting and doing what business needs to do, and actually the problem is IT not being able to deal with that and not sufficiently facilitating that, and we're putting our own organizations at risk.
Yeah, I like that. Again, can you hear me, Kylie?
Yeah, I think my internet.
So I agree wholeheartedly with that. Okay. The organization I was with was cloud first, SaaS first approach, and that very much came from the top down, CIO down. And so we worked diligently, and that's why it was all about establishing the right criteria, the right controls up front, because also as a heavily regulated entity, you needed to make sure that if any of the regulators came in, you could show the proper due diligence, the proper measurement, and also the ability to terminate and transition in the event of continued service level breaches. But yes, the idea of shadow IT today really, to me, is about all individuals have become far more sophisticated when it comes to what they want. The challenge that we can talk about is the ability to how many similar platforms do you need, because your team in Costa Rica versus your team in Vilnius versus your team in Singapore all had different desires for different platforms to do the same thing. and that tends to be a little bit of a challenge. But yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. And the suggestion here is to not treat all SaaS as the same. As we've been looking at, is the idea here is if you have enterprise SaaS, there's going to be different people involved because those contracts, multi-year contracts. So, for example, for those of you who are using Salesforce today and are using Commerce Cloud, right? Their metric of GMV now, which is a percent of all the revenue going through their e-commerce side. A lot of organizations are up in arms because of COVID. Their retail sales stores have been essentially shut down or dramatically lower, where e-commerce sales is dramatically higher, but net they're still lower than where they wanted to be, but their cost have skyrocketed because of their contract structure. So there's a lot of things that you would do in the enterprise space that you would not do in the more tactical elements of SaaS.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was just meant to be a high-level overview of the things that we can do, but ultimately, many times when I'm working with an organization who is wrestling with SaaS, interestingly, the question kind of comes up later in the discussion saying, geez, Jim, can you help us design some sort of a governance model? Because even though we're trying to get good prices and we're negotiating a renewal, we just don't have one unified view. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do with proper governance is, you have the right scripts, everybody's aligned on the roadmap, the same messaging is going to the SaaS providers. So you're able to align and present more of a single face than a siloed, dysfunctional face. And really what that means is we can now talk about what I call empowered SaaS optimization. And again, my orientation is different than sourcing. I've never owned or had a sourcing role. My role was vendor management, where I began to look then at the layers of optimization. So that's what we're going to move into today. Okay. So the question was asked early on, about optimization, and I think the struggle can be when teams are given a budget. And accounting systems, IT finance systems are different or challenged to track. If you're able to realize an optimization in that individual budget, where does that money fall to? Does it fall into the CIO's budget? Does it fall into the business unit's budget? So a lot of times you have some interesting challenges around what optimization is. But really what we want to talk here about is the how. How do you optimize? And what I'm about to share with you is my view around multi-level optimization. And the question was asked earlier, but when is it good enough? What is good enough? And right now, obviously with COVID and the significant focus on save, you have this issue around, optimizing that save, cost avoidance, to help your organization because of these very strange times. But when you look at now moving into optimization, the essentials here is we've already segmented, but now we're going to take another look at the organizations that are providing us SaaS, and we really want to categorize them. So for those of you in the third-party risk circles, or those of you who are dealing heavily in InfoSec, even you may have a little small SaaS provider that did not show up as enterprise or any of the other categories, but they may be touching a piece of data, or they may be occupying a role in your supply chain or your value chain, that if they went down, it would be have an immediate and severe impact to your business. So now the idea of categorization overlays segmentation. So of those SaaS providers, which are essential, strategic, emerging, basic, and you can come up with whatever categories you can. But what this then does is says, okay, if these are essential, how do we manage this relationship? So for those of you who are Gartner subscribers or Forrester or whoever else are out there, many organizations have the concept of strategic vendor management. And that's really what this is intended to do, is if you've got essential strategic emerging players in your environment, they're aligned to your roadmap, you really want to approach them, not just from a governance standpoint, but then how do you make sure you're leveraging what they can bring, which again is an aspect of optimization. You also want to talk about health. So for those of you who have a third-party risk, SaaS organizations, many SaaS organizations all have an exit strategy, right? I can't tell you, and I'm sure you have had the same experience as I, is many software or SaaS organizations, their goal is to be acquired. So whether it be, IBM, SAP, Salesforce, the Oracle, right? Their exit strategy is to be acquired. So it all comes down to burn rate, and you want to make sure that they're sufficiently funded, or you may have a emerging risk that you need to keep an eye on. And that's where sourcing, InfoSec, you guys work together to do that. Easy one, the renewal calendar. Enterprise SaaS, from a renewal standpoint, you can really get your arms around it because the prices are bigger, the time frames are different. But many of the more category specific SaaS are annual renewals, and the rhythm needs to be addressed there. So these are just things in which to do to really begin to set the floor or the foundation for SaaS within your organization. So Kylie, questions here?
Yeah, great, good timing. So Jim, the discussion around shadow IT had some interesting, some other people making some other interesting comments. So somebody said, shadow IT is often where your organization's innovation emerges and where you start spotting that first. And then somebody else actually had a similar story to the CIO that I've mentioned before, that they heard a CIO say that she didn't mind shadow IT as long as she knew about it, because for her it was a sign of a computer literate workforce. And I think what's interesting is, of course, if I see SaaS as experimentation, so the people who are taking out these sort of single function line of business SaaS applications are experimenting with them to see if they're any good and to see if they help the business. And of course, if they succeed, then that is going to grow and grow and grow. And at some point, it's probably going to become a fairly strategic piece of software for that organization. So how would you recommend that once we've sort of spotted one of these growing tactical SaaS pieces of software, how do we sort of start routing them correctly so that they gradually become more and more highly governed as they become more strategic and important for the organization?
So I love the comment, Kylie, where you said the CIO just wants to know about it.
Right.
Because the CIO wants to know about it. The CISO needs to know about it. The third-party risk organization needs to know about it. So that's what we talked about a little earlier, was the idea of this onboarding. So and I'm fully supportive of shadow IT as long as there is a clear onboarding process that we described earlier, where very quickly sourcing, InfoSec, going through the grid that we had talked about the first slide, where they can identify and make sure that onboarding has been done appropriately. So we now know that this SaaS is out there, we know what it's touching, we know what it's meant to do, and that we're not creating any vulnerabilities in our environment. And let's say those individual businesses followed those rules of bringing someone on. We get in trouble when someone drops the credit card or goes off and rogue and doesn't make the rest of the business aware of it. Because now what happens if they go through that process and success and value is starting to be realized, it can start to be applied elsewhere. The other concept, if you could parallel this to, we're talking SaaS, but if you started talking about platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, many organizations have set up a cloud COE. So what happens is, as various parts of the business start moving a workload to the cloud, they still come into kind of a central architecture to make sure it's aligning with the InfoSec requirements and all the other architectural requirements. What we also see for those of your organizations that are heavily adopting artificial intelligence or RPA, you see centers of excellence popping up there. So not only are these shadow IT or individual business units experimenting or trying to implement or explore how those technologies can improve their processes, but they're enabling or engaging a central authority to help them do that. So it's not a bureaucratic thing, but they have this resource internally that can be helped. So what my hope is yes, we want to know about it. We want to make sure it goes through the right criteria, because if the regulators come a calling, you want to be able to answer all those questions. But then how do we make sure the team in London and what they're experiencing is aligned with the team in Frankfurt and in Chicago? How do we make sure they're aligned when someone's having successes, the others can quickly take advantage of that success? So and we'll end up, my last slide, I talk about the goal of a SaaS COE, it being able to actually facilitate the shadow IT, let's say, phenomena. Does that make sense, Kylie?
Yes.
Okay, great questions, guys. Please keep asking. I'll move along here. I see we're on time. So now we've done what I call step one. Now we need to move into step two, and this gets to the question of optimization. And please remember, I spend most of my days in the world of software audits or helping organizations look at their SaaS usage and determine what is the actual level of usage, to see if there's optimization opportunities or ways in which license structures can get moved around to be more efficient. And the little hint I have here is always look for data sources to triangulate with. So in the world of SaaS, the portals, the tenants, the orgs, whatever that particular supplier calls their areas in which your admin can go in and generate reporting, all of this data is available to you. But I can tell you 90% of the time, organizations just don't know how to take advantage of that data. So here's the opportunity where a COE can be going into the data and analyzing it for that particular area, coming back with really good, detailed, and I have here levels that they can look at through the use of the data. And then the final one, level 5, has to do with use your Active Directory. Your InfoSec may have a separate CMDB. So use those sources to really make sure you're pulling those, optimizing those licenses, and very much understand usage. And this is not about just cost cutting, but it's about how can you do it better? What are the teams using that maybe you can negotiate better? What are the things that teams are using that maybe is on your roadmap that you can bring that SaaS provider in and say, hey, let's collaborate on that next generation platform. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And then moving now to step 3, where the conversation has been leading to, is how do you harness this? And the interesting thing about SaaS today, because of shadow IT, there's been a little bit of resistance about a central SaaS authority, and maybe that has to do a little bit with the I don't say bureaucratic aspects of it. But the opportunity now to marry up governance and optimization, I propose the concept of a SaaS Optimization Council, and you go through the standard activities there with a mission statement, sponsor, and stakeholder management. And what I have found is organizations are more willing to entertain the concept when you talk about the concept, kind of like with the EU, is a rotating chairperson, right? So it's not just sourcing, it's not just vendor management, it's not just architecture. Everyone gets a chance to lead it, right? That's one approach. But when you then look over on the right side, now we're about monitoring and bringing intelligence. And that intelligence is meant to make sure you're getting all of the value out of your investment, but all of the value to the business in a lot of different manners. Okay, and then ultimately, as we just spoke about, and I'm seeing more of this in particular in the Salesforce space. So Salesforce, for those of you who use it, this is not news to you. Salesforce is unbelievably complex when you start talking about their clouds, the number of orgs using those clouds, the license component of those orgs, then the customization that's coming in. So the opportunity for SaaS to really bring technical expertise to help these organizations or your business units or these siloed areas really harness the benefit of that particular SaaS platform. But mostly today, I'm seeing the emergence of this around Salesforce, more so than like a Workday or a SuccessFactors or others. I think Salesforce continues to lead this segment, and as we see SAP with their e-commerce acquisition last week, Oracle pushing in, more and more of that I think will begin to emerge. So I know we're at time, so is this a great time for any additional questions, Kylie?
Yes. So
Okay.
I think what your concept of a SaaS optimization council is a really interesting one, and something that I've worked with a couple of companies to implement. But we broadened it out really to actually consider all of our renewals, not just SaaS too. So it effectively became the oversight body for Oracle renewals and IBM renewals and a load of on-premise renewals as well as SaaS. So kept them busy, which was good. There's nothing worse than a load of senior people sitting around twiddling their thumbs and wondering why they're attending a meeting. So,
well, what's fun is the language and rhythm of SaaS, and again, when you listen to what Xylo has to say, there's hundreds of SaaS in most enterprises, and many of them they're unaware of. So the tool can go out and discover. But yes, in my book, the SAM Leader Survival Guide, I speak a lot about the benefit of the exact thing that you just described as it relates to primarily SAM, but obviously SaaS now becoming a major part of your software spend, and then also keeping an eye on your BYOL implications in platform or infrastructure as a service.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So do we have any other questions coming through? I'm not seeing any. Or any other comments for Jim?
Well, for the advice that I offer the clients that I work with is and primarily my entry now is working with software asset professionals, and then broadening into the organization. And what unfortunately I'm finding is that when it comes to SaaS, many times the SAM professional is not involved in any way. And that even comes down to Azure or AWS, Google. So what I'm fearing is that for those of you who are SAM professionals listening in, that this very important segment is potentially leaving SAM behind. So SAM professionals need to be able to equally confidently talk about compliance and optimization, and bring that SAM diligence, discipline into the world of SaaS. And that I think is a very real need. And as we all know, when people start talking about subscriptions, they automatically say, well, there's no compliance issue, so we'll be fine. But for those of you who use SuccessFactors, Workday, for example, Adobe Creative Cloud, ServiceNow, you have these hybrid scenarios that you can not only be overspending and missing optimization opportunities, but you could also be in a compliance issue as well. So I do think that SAM leaders need to make sure they have a seat at the table and can bring that discipline in and the intelligence in to those SaaS conversations.
For sure. We have a comment about metrics. Just a comment that metrics are important, but if we reward our users for utilization, then potentially they're going to be gaming the metrics. So I guess we need to think carefully around how we measure our SaaS utilization, and make sure that we're thinking about whether that's people are utilizing it at an appropriate level, for instance, or maybe they've got more, a higher level of access than they really need, or those sorts of issues. So
Yeah, the bigger thing I see, and I absolutely agree with that, is the disconnect between internal processes. So typically we see when we run any SaaS optimization up against Active Directory. All right, so InfoSec is diligently removing people from Active Directory to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities. But the connection between that and the actual SaaS platform and harvesting that license, significant gaps there. So that tends to be where the optimization opportunities really come in. And then also what tends to happen is if individuals, me as the owner of that particular SaaS, or my team having particular license type, a lot of times we come in and are able to show that they can save money based on reduction of that license type for their staff, but that business owner is unwilling to do so because he or she does not want to go to their team and say, hey, you get this license type, you get that license type, right? So there's an equity, right? thing. So the bigger issue tends to be many organizations are heavy users of contractors, so making sure that the contractors have the appropriate license type. And even we've seen in the world of Office 365, believe it or not, we've seen licenses assigned to espresso machines. So, and I'm all for that. As long as the coffee is flowing, we're good.
Yeah. So there's another question here. How do you manage SaaS cross-contamination of systems and data against end-user license agreements? I don't really quite understand the question. Maybe it's Robert Sirignano. Maybe Robert, if you could expand a little bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and what I would propose to anyone who would like, I'm very fortunate where I'm backed by a team of auditors, former auditors. So I have a really incredible team. The gentleman who leads it is former Deloitte, and we have 30 additional analysts. And if there's technical questions that you have, please feel free to send it to my Gmail, and I'd be more than happy to field that question to the technical team. I spend much of my time trying to take SAM speak or SaaS speak and presenting it to a CIO or CFO or IT finance, kind of interpret it for them so they can understand it. I think that, as I talked about earlier, one of the reasons I think SAM is kind of being left in the dust is their fascination with data and throwing dashboards at the executives, and then not helping the executive understand what's the value of that. So for those of you who know the show, again, I said I'm in New York, who know the show Seinfeld, Sam is throwing data at these executives, and the executives are hearing yada yada yada, right? But yeah, please feel free to send me any questions. Happy to bring them into my team of experts, and they would be able to address that.
Yeah. So Robert's responded actually. So he said where data is used by SaaS systems, but it's actually generated by other systems. So I guess the SAP indirect licensing is an example of that sort of issue.
Yeah, and SAP, well, I wouldn't have indirect licensing or their digital access program as really as a SaaS thing. But yeah, most of the data is available via each of the individual SaaS providers' portals. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of the time we find clients just don't know how to access it, or or they're pulling the superficial data and not getting down to the deep data. In the world of SAP, I do think that the digital access program, they're trying with the use of the passport tool, and previous to that, the estimation tool, they're actually use both to try to get your arms around what are the documents and the document types that you're using. So I do in the world of software asset, it's interesting. I did a blog maybe 3-4 months back, and simply made a comment at the end of it, where I was talking about what we're seeing from an audit standpoint, and I said something like Oracle is Oracle, and I think that generated like 5,000 views on LinkedIn. So, but yeah, I think SAP, they do have, obviously, similar to the LMS organization Oracle, SAP has their global license and audit and compliance team, but it's just a different dynamic there. But an enhanced audit that they would do can be very invasive. So the goal there is really to make sure you're using the assets that they make available to you to more accurately, for your self-measurement efforts. But again, that's a bit of a separate issue.
One thing I've observed on a quite a different topic, actually, one thing I have observed is that a lot of software asset management teams feel under a huge amount of pressure to save money, even though they have very little control over the budgets. So there might be a load of SaaS product that's being bought and is managed directly by the business, and yet the SAM team feel that they need to be getting their arms around that and trying to save money. Particularly at the moment, obviously. So what are your thoughts around that sort of conflict of interest and how software asset management teams can handle that and take some of that pressure off themselves?
Well, yeah, it's a great point, right? So it's authority versus accountability. And SAM itself, when you have IT teams doing deployments and maybe not paying attention to the metrics that are required, and then if an audit occurs or you do a self audit, somehow SAM's accountable. So I think the same, as you just said, the same applies in SaaS. But really, it's all about the data. As the other gentleman just questioned, is how can we begin to get into this data, do the analysis, begin to identify where the save opportunities are, but where the process, what's the root cause of that save? And then look for those process improvement areas. So for example, in my former life, I was responsible for telecom expense management. And it's somewhat similar, where we would get our invoices, and then the TEM analyst would sit down and pore over it to make sure that the bill was accurate. And then we would find out that circuits that were shut off, we were still being charged for. So then we had to go back to our network team and say, you said this was shut off. Why is it still here? And so they had to take the action to harvest it. So I think what we're able to do is, it's one thing to say, here is the optimization opportunities, but we don't necessarily have the ability to hit the button and harvest that. If a third party has to do it, then we have to hold them accountable. So it's the idea of what I call harvest effectiveness, and that's something that our team of analysts check ongoing.
Yeah, as a process specialist, that's music to my ears. So I think we are we're on time. We're at the end of our times now. So thank you so much, Jim, and thank you very much to the audience. Some great questions there, and it was a good conversation. So hopefully everyone has enjoyed it. Just a reminder, we do have another session this evening. And I would tell you who it is, but it's completely slipped my mind. Mark Harrison, who is another of our international attendees, who is going to be attending from New Zealand. So it's not quite as early as it is for Jim, actually. Jim said it was 5:30, probably about 6:30 now where he is. It's going to Mark's session is 6:30 a.m. New Zealand time and 6:30 p.m. UK time. So anyway, as I said, thank you very much, Jim. It was a really great talk, and I'm sure everyone else enjoyed it. And hopefully I will speak to many of you again later this evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.